Since the end of World War II, the United States has been the global hegemon, driving the world economy and establishing itself as the leader of the world. For years, US government officials have preached that the world is better when America leads, and that every nation should embrace the same democratic principles of the United States in order to achieve success. This message worked for a while, but then China came along and challenged this theory. With China's rise as a hybrid economy that stays true to its socialist roots while embracing Western capitalism, it has proven there is more than one way to achieve economic success as a nation. 20 years ago, the US was the top trading partner to the majority of the world, but the past 2 decades has seen this power shift directly to Asia and most specifically to China, who is now the top trading partner to over 120 countries around the globe. Just look at the dramatic shift we've seen in Africa, as even former French colonies shifted away from their former colonial master and moved towards a closer relationship with China for a brighter future. The reality is that the future of the 21st century no longer belongs to the United States, but instead Asia. Just listen to the insights of the former president of the UN Security Council, Kishore Mahbubani, who reveals the cold hard truth on why the US-China relationship is increasing in tension. The 20th century was the American century, and the US believes the 21st century should be as well. But that's very unrealistic. The American century is over, and the Asian century is coming. This prediction of the end of the US-led Western world order is indeed shocking and bold, but in today's video, I'll reveal how the economic center of our world is shifting away from the West and why Kishore's prediction of an Asian 21st century is in fact true. If you believe his claim is nonsense, just wait, as I've got some incredible data that will expose the truth on what's really happening. So let's break it down. When it comes to credentials for informed and intelligent commentary on world affairs, you can match Kishore Mahbubani's resume. He's one of a kind because he's practically the only politician that commands the respect of both Western and Chinese elites. Hailing from Singapore, he's a close friend and ally of both the US and China. His over 30 years in public office had him stationed all over the world and gave him a deep understanding not only of China and Asia, but also the US and the West. If you remember any of his insights from today's video, make sure it's this one. The US containment of the Soviet Union succeeded because back then more countries traded with the US than the Soviet Union. However, the US containment of China will fail because it's the opposite situation. China has already integrated itself with the world more than the US has, and more countries do trade with China than they do with the US. Because of that, if the US tries to contain China, instead of the US isolating China, the US will find itself isolated from the rest of the world. This perfectly illustrates how drastically the power dynamic in our world has shifted and why the American century is in fact over. At the end of the Cold War, North America, Western Europe, and Japan commanded over 70% of the global economy. Of course, this has shifted tremendously over the past 4 decades, and a quick comparison of the G7 exposes the reality of today's economic situation. In 1995, the G7 countries commanded an incredible 44.9% share of the global economy in terms of purchase power parity. The BRICS countries of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa at that time was a mere 16.9%. But fast forward 15 years, and the BRICS network was quickly gaining steam, increasing their share to 26.6%, while the G7 countries lost 10 percentage points and declined to 34.3%. Last year, BRICS officially overtook the G7 alliance and now enjoys a 32.1% share of the global GDP. The truth is that the fastest growing economies in the world over the last 20 to 30 years have all been in Asia, and Kishore asserts this trend will continue. The new CIA, China, India, and ASEAN will be the fastest growing economies over the next decade or so. Kishore continues with a breathtaking statistic about ASEAN, the bloc of Southeast Asian nations. From 2010 to 2020, ASEAN, with its 3 trillion GDP, contributed more to global economic growth than the EU, with its GDP of 17 trillion. Let that sink in. The EU's GDP is more than 5x that of ASEAN's, and yet it has still been outpaced by these Southeast Asian nations. Every European leader should take note of this frankly embarrassing statistic. But Kishore isn't done yet. He reveals additional mind-boggling statistics about the US. In 1950, the US GNP, or gross national product, was almost 50% of the entire world's GNP, but now it's closer to 20%. Comparing this to China, he adds, in 2000, US GNP was in nominal market terms 8x bigger than China's, but now it's only about 1.5 times bigger, and China's economy could become larger than that of the US. But it's not just the US or EU. Take Japan, which is of course part of Asia, but but in many ways considered part of the West. Here, Kishore reveals yet another stunning insight. In 2000, Japan towered over the world as its second largest economy. Its GDP in nominal market terms was $5 trillion, more than 8x the combined GDP of ASEAN at $650 billion. Yet, by 2022, ASEAN's GDP has already reached 3.6 trillion, and Japan's GDP of 4.2 is only 1.2 times bigger. By 2030, ASEAN's combined economy will be bigger than Japan's. Has the West accepted this inevitable power shift towards this new multipolar world we now live in? Has it given rising developing countries greater voice and recognition to their needs? It has not, and frankly, it has done the exact opposite. There's no better example of this than the United States' new policy of full-scale containment of China. The US initiated a massive trade war with China and is trying its best to stifle Chinese economic growth to maintain its position as the global hegemon. The US has sanctioned Chinese firms and blocked them from accessing cutting-edge Western technology, most notably advanced microchips. At the same time, in a very protectionist and anti-capitalistic move, it has banned Chinese firms from doing business in the United States, most notably Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications giant who dominates 5G technology around the world. What's more, the US has coerced its vassal states in NATO to get on board with this policy of containment. For example, it pressured Dutch company ASML, which is the world leader and a crucial technology needed to make cutting-edge microchips, to stop selling its products to China. The truth is that the US has one simple mission: remain the sole hegemon and convince the world that it's better off and safer under its leadership and its leadership alone. The US is fighting to maintain the unipolar world, which it has created and been the leader of since it emerged victorious from World War II. Kishore further explains this. There is resistance in the US to accepting a multipolar world and sharing power. The US would like to believe that the 20th century was the American century. The 21st century should also be the American century. Western media refuses to accept the fact that the 21st century will be the Asian century. So they always keep telling you stories: why Asia is failing, why China's economic growth is over, why the Asians will keep fighting each other. They'll only give you negative stories about Asia. This also explains why the US has now spent so much time and money boosting its military presence in East Asia, effectively surrounding China with military bases. But this is actually a huge mistake by the US. The future rivalry of the US and China will not be a military conquest, but an economic one. It will simply come down to which country has the larger economy. This is why it's a huge mistake for the US to spend so much time and money boosting its military presence in East Asia to contain China. When US President Donald Trump withdrew the US from the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2017, this was another major error for the future of the US economy. At that exact same time, China joined the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which was a clear signal that the future of trade among Asian nations would run through China and not the US. By not participating in these trade agreements across the Pacific, the US was actually giving China an advantage in the main economic contest. The simple truth is that the global north must change its course and make strategic adjustments in this new multipolar world. Sadly, it is not. This is shown most clearly in the continued northern domination, if not dictatorship, of the world's two most important global economic institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. At the G20 summit in London in April 2009, it was explicitly promised that the future leaders of the IMF and World Bank would be selected on the basis of merit, not geographical regions. After 15 years, this promise has not been kept, and the Global South has been given neither a voice nor a fair voting share in running these two organizations. A country's voting share in the IMF is supposed to represent its share of global GDP. The discrepancy is largest for China. Its share of global GDP has risen to 18%, but its voting share of the IMF remains at 6%. But Kishore goes on to reveal additional astonishing unfair aspects of these crucial world institutions that are rigged in favor of the West. The sad truth is that the EU, which makes up around 5% of the world's population, is overrepresented in most global organizations, commanding 20% of the G20 seats and 40% of the 5 permanent seats in the UN Security Council. Indeed, the global north only makes up 15% of the world's population. So why do they continue to refuse the rest of the world their fair representation, all while asserting that they should be the sole leaders? How is that even democratic? Perhaps it has something to do with what the late Lee Kuan Yew, the founding father of Singapore, so brilliantly predicted many years ago. For America to be displaced by an Asian people long despised and dismissed with contempt as decadent, feeble, corrupt, and inept is emotionally very difficult to accept. The sense of cultural supremacy of the Americans will make this adjustment most difficult. French President Emmanuel Macron was absolutely right when he said at the Munich Security Conference in February 2023, "I am struck by how we have lost the trust of the global South." Is it working? Kishore reveals with blunt, compelling examples that reveal the shocking truth. We need to look no further than China's Belt and Road Initiative. The US has mounted a strong global campaign to persuade countries around the world not to join the BRI. While this has been partially successful, the truth is that a whopping 150 out of 193 member states of the United Nations have joined China's BRI, the vast majority of them being Global South countries. There could be no louder signal than the Global South will pursue its own course even in the face of opposition from the North. This failure by the West actually reflects the broader state of the US containment policy, which Kishore once again sheds light on. The Biden administration was initially under the impression that many countries in the world would rush to support the US in their efforts to contain or isolate China. But they have found that very few countries in the world, even some of their closest allies, are enthusiastic about trying to contain China. So it has taken 2 years for the Biden administration to understand the world is not joining them. If you think India will be an exception and join the US in containing China, think again. Kishore once again reveals the truth. The US is naturally trying to woo India very strongly currently. In the Cold War, Henry Kissinger came to Beijing in 1971 to try and get China to support the US in the contest against the Soviet Union. Just as what Henry Kissinger did in 1971, Joe Biden is trying to do in 2023. But India is too big a country to become an ally of the US. India wants to emerge as an independent pole in a multipolar world. That will be good for the world and good for Asia. The same is true for other major current events that are reshaping our world as we know it. Take the Ukraine war, for example. 85% of the world's population has not imposed sanctions on Russia. Indeed, Russia's trade with Global South has grown significantly post-Ukraine invasion. For example, Russia's trade with India has grown by a whopping 205% in 2022, primarily due to the surge of discounted Russian oil exports to India. Significantly, the war in Ukraine took place while memories were still fresh of the COVID-19 pandemic, during which the West had a surplus of vaccines but did not share them with the Global South. There's perhaps no greater event demonstrating just how differently the Global South sees the world than the recent war between Israel and Hamas. The Global South, in fact, the majority of the world has firmly stood up against Israel's brutal onslaught into Palestine, which has now killed over 20,000 Palestinians, mostly civilian women and children, and called for an immediate ceasefire at the United Nations. Only the United States, Israel, and a handful of other countries have abstained from this vote. This perhaps, more than anything, has exposed the deep fault lines between the global North and the South and will only accelerate this massive shifting of power taking place. In conclusion, Kishore has a stark warning to the West. Learn to coexist and cooperate with the rest of the world or be doomed to complete isolation and decline. The reality is actually quite simple. The West represents only a fraction of the world's population, less than 20%. And because the Global South is rising and developing economic clout, the West's traditional strategy of dominating and exploiting these nations in order to get its way and make its own rules favorable to only itself will no longer work. Kishore goes on to state, something profound is happening in the world, a kind of metaphysical detachment of the West from the West. In the case of the US, Kishore wisely recommends that the US can continue to be hard on China on the surface in order to pacify its strongly anti-China domestic audience. But in reality, it must cooperate with China. Otherwise, it will not succeed in its containment and remain the world's sole hegemony, but instead become isolated and hasten its decline. However, the important thing to understand is that this is not a zero-sum game or the inevitable end of the West. Instead, if the West learns to coexist and cooperate with the Global South and show them the respect and equality they've always deserved, the entire world will win. Everyone, I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to spend it with me here on YouTube. Make sure to subscribe and let me know what you think in the comments down below. And I look forward to seeing you all in our next video soon.